what we'll be talking about today, which is control tower. So just a little introduction on myself. My name is Donovan Brady. I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture here at Logicworks. And Logicworks is a cloud services provider, providing the complete suite of services from professional services, migration support, optimization, managed services, and operational support, as well as a whole suite of capabilities around data transformation, app refactoring, data and application modernization. But today we will be talking about how to architect a multi-account architecture on AWS. So for anybody who had seen this on my LinkedIn when I shared it out, I started out by saying when you're building a house or really any important structure, any building, any logical structure, the foundation is the most important component, right? How are you going to be able to build a house if you don't have anything to build off of, right? So why should it be any different than AWS? When you're migrating to the cloud, you should have an important foundation there as well. So let's dig in. When we're talking about managing your IT infrastructure, we usually have various teams with different requirements, right? You have, let's say, a client portal team who's in charge of creating software for your customers to look at your application suite, right? The compliance team who is really only in charge of the compliance and security controls. You know, let's say maybe you're HIPAA compliant. They need to make sure that you guys are fully encrypted, privately accessed, and have your proper security controls in place, right? Your web app team, maybe they run all the rest of your front-end platforms for your customers. And finally, your accounting team, they just want to make sure that you guys aren't running up the bill like crazy. Now, as you could understand, each one of these teams has a different level of granularity or access that's required for their AWS presence, right? The client portal team probably is, oh, it actually looks like some of these got mixed up. Well, let's say that the client portal team actually needs console access, database write access, and S3 upload access, but they don't need billing access, right? The compliance team needs read-only access. They don't need billing access. They need to see the security tooling and log management. The web app team, they also need operating system level access, database access, Git repo access, and the accounting team really just needs to see the billing access, right? What does this look like? Well, traditionally, as you just heard with Anselmo, we would handle this with a multi-VPC hub and spoke model, right? You'll probably have a main hub VPC that has the management tools, maybe any centralized or shared services go in that VPC, and then each of the other teams, either their applications get segmented into one of these individual VPCs, or they just have read-only access. So up here, you can see the accounting team has an IAM permission that gives them access to AWS Cost Explorer, and they don't really have access to the applications or the infrastructure themselves. The compliance team has read-only access to these tools, but they're not really doing anything. They're just looking, making sure that things are deployed properly. And then you have your app dev teams around your client portal and your web apps. They have direct access to the infrastructure, maybe logging into the instances, hitting those load balancers that you see here. And these VPCs are going to be peered. Now, there are a few considerations when you run a multi-VPC architecture, right? For example, what happens when you need multiple levels of separation? Let's say instead of just having one level of production, you also have a dev environment or a stage environment. Well, now we actually are adding a bit more complexity to your architecture. You don't really want your prod and your dev resources to be shared in the same VPC, right? But when you have VPCs segmented by the team, client portal, for example, it really makes sense to have the client portal resources all together. But then that segmentation doesn't really work. So you get stuck. Other reasons, blast radius, right? You really don't want a change in dev to affect your changes in production. But you have to get really granular with your permissions and with your policies at the dev level and at the prod level to make sure that there's no commingling of resources or any actions taken on dev don't affect your prod. How do you do that? Well, we segment them into different accounts. So what you can see here is there's going to be a central management account at the top level, and then you can have different organizational units or groupings or even just accounts. Let's say this is a single account for the client portal account with prod, stage, and dev VPCs, and then all the other accounts have their VPCs thereafter, right? This allows you to get that granular segmentation of your application levels, your SDLC tiers from your dev, stage, prod, UAT, QA, you name it, you can segment it, and you don't really have to worry about account limits that you might run into. You know, for those of you who have done a lot of development in AWS know that there are soft limits when you're deploying. So when you first deploy, you can only have 5 VPCs. So you'll have to go in and request a limit increase. You know, if you have it segmented by account, then you don't really run into that issue. You could also segment it by business need. As we mentioned before, I used HIPAA, but what about PCI? Anybody who has dealt with an audit before knows that they are a pain in the neck. And there are a lot of considerations that you need to make for all of the infrastructure that's in scope for that audit. So if I have an entire account that could potentially be in scope for an audit, let's say PCI, but only a few resources are using or transmitting PCI level data, you would want to segment that out, right? So you can have the PCI data in one account, and then your second account can have all the other resources. It significantly decreases your audit costs, the audit scope, the audit time, and highly increases your probability of passing that audit. Well, let's summarize what we just talked about. We want to have better isolation by SDLC tier. We want to have administrative isolation between workloads. We want to have limited visibility and discoverability of workloads and minimized blast radius. These 3 things I put together pretty much hand in hand every time I talk about this, because you don't want your dev resources to affect your prod resources. You don't want, knocking on wood here, you don't want some hacker to get into your dev environment and get your fake data, but also get your prod level real data, right? Knocking on wood again, if you were to get breached, let's hope that they only get to your dev environment, but if those resources are commingled, they pretty much have access to everything. And then finally, strong isolation for auditing your data. How does this tie into the control tower and landing zone discussion? Well, I'll start from the beginning. A few years ago, this started out, I would say, as a market endeavor, right? The industry had said, we have these restraints and we need to fix them. So let's start architecting some solutions that work. And so the community started deploying multi-account level infrastructure. And Amazon does what Amazon does best, and they iterated on that and put some automation forward for the community to take advantage of. That started out as a tool called AWS Landing Zone. And AWS Landing Zone is a well-defined set of CloudFormation templates that you deploy in your environment, and it pretty much sets up all of the automation that's required for your multi-account structure, for centralized logging, for isolated VPCs, pretty much everything that we're talking about right now, it would handle for you. However, it was pretty complicated to set up, and you have to have deep expertise with CloudFormation in order to use that, right? Fast forward a couple of years, AWS came out with Control Tower, which is basically a GUI-based version of Landing Zone that obfuscates the automation piece from you so that it does that on the back end. You don't even have to worry about it. You're not deploying the CloudFormation templates. You don't have to go in and make sure that the pipeline's working. It kind of just works. It does it for you. It transitions the work from actual deployment and engineering work more into design work. There's a really neat feature that allows you to add in plugins wherever you need. So you can create your own custom Terraform or CloudFormation templates so that you can have things like we just mentioned, centralized logging or centralized egress, the transit gateway conversation that we just heard about, or network load balancers, service catalogs. All of those things you can actually add in as add-ons to the control tower with your own custom automation. So what is control tower? Well, it's a few things. First, it's a prescriptive, secure, multi-account AWS environment and architecture. It's not just the tool itself, it's a theory, it's a methodology. When you deploy the control tower, you'll see in a couple slides the diagrams. When you're deploying it, you actually see by default 4 accounts that get spun up for you. I'll get into that a little bit later. It's a great starting point for a large-scale AWS migration, whether that is I have multiple business units that are trying to be migrated and they all have different requirements, as we just said, or we just have a lot of infrastructure, right? It could be, well, I have a single tenant SaaS company and we have an application that spreads across many different customers. All of them have different isolation, segregation requirements, compliance requirements. They need to be isolated. Multi-account structure, right? The automation also allows you to expand over time. The more that you guys grow in AWS as people migrate to AWS, or even if it's net new builds, again, that foundation, you want to make sure that the foundation is built for you to be able to scale. Back to that house analogy, if I build a house on a foundation of a plot of 30 feet by 30 feet, it's going to take a lot of work for me to then go back retroactively and dig out additional depth for the yard, and then maybe have to get zoning requirements. You don't want to do that in AWS. It's pretty much the same theory. If I'm deployed with everything in a single account with hard-coded VPCs and I'm hitting limits, it's going to be very hard for me to retroactively go back and fix all this stuff to scale. So let's start from the beginning and scale with control tower, right? It allows you to define your baseline requirements for each account while providing separation of concerns, whether that's at the operational point or the security and compliance point or blast radius, right? We can separate all of our applications, all of our dev tiers into different groupings of organizational units or accounts that have their own set of permissions and guidelines. We can also separate the environments to prevent unintended changes to production. Like I mentioned before, if I'm making a change in dev and dev is isolated in its own account, that change is not going to affect my production resources in a production account. Whereas if they're all in the same account, they might affect each other. And finally, you limit your threat exposure. If there were a breach and they get into your dev account, they're not going to have access to your production data unless you explicitly give them access through cross-account roles, right? So how does control tower differ from landing zone? Well, landing zone is partner-led only, right? It is very customizable. It's highly customizable with the CloudFormation templates that you can tweak every single piece. Control tower is a little bit more prescriptive because that underlying architecture and pipeline is deployed for you, but you can still create those add-ons, as I mentioned, and it's self-service. Any one of you can go into the AWS console right now, click through a few buttons, and you're actually deployed in a new control tower. Like I said, the proof is in the design phase for the control tower, so even though it sounds easy, it's not as easy as I make it sound. So, what does this architecture actually look like? Well, at the top level, you have your master organizations account, right? This is the top level account or domain, whatever you want to call it, that leverages AWS organizations and control tower on the backbone, right? AWS organizations is AWS's way to actually manage and manipulate a multi-account structure without having to worry about multiple different billing arms and permissions and automation. It handles all of that for you. I say, hey, I've got this one master account. It's going to be my main organization account, and then all the other accounts that I build under it are going to roll up to that. So I could get one bill that has all of my accounts just under this one master account organization, right? Control Tower builds off of AWS organizations and uses principles that we already know and love with organizations and takes them to the next level. That's what you see here with this other automation. Control Tower uses Lambda with Service Catalog and CloudFormation stack sets on the back end to take templates that you could deploy, that you could create, and automatically deploy them for you. So let's go through some of those use cases that I said before. Let's say there's a single tenant SaaS company, and we have an application that we want to deploy. We just onboarded a new customer, right? Well, I could go through the whole painstaking process of manually deploying all of this infrastructure and testing it and tweaking it and making sure that every time a customer is up, I have to manually deploy this stuff. Or I can automate that, templatize it, put it in Control Tower, and then have Service Catalog automatically deploy all of my backbone essentials for my foundation, right? That's what you see down here with these shared services, logging and security. We can make sure that we have centralized logging. We can make sure that the default VPC is not deployed because that's a security risk. We'll make sure that CloudTrail and config is turned on, and any permissions at the organizational level that we want to deploy, or guidelines or guardrails, they are going to automatically be deployed into these environments. Let's say I don't want anybody to have SSH or RDP access into the instances in production, right? I can actually set that up at that top level SCP, that service control policy, at the organizational level. And then I can tweak that for each segmentation of the organization. I can say this goes for all accounts under my AWS organization. I can say it goes under an organizational unit, which has some subset of accounts under it, or I can say that it's specifically just for these handful of accounts and denote it that way. The best practice is to do it at the organizational unit level and not the account level. However, it's customizable and you can do it however you want. There are a couple other things that you'll see in here, like the account vending machine, but we'll get into that a little later. It's called the account factory now. So as we just mentioned, by default, you get deployed 3 core accounts outside of that master account. You get the centralized logging account, you get the security account, and you get the shared services account. We also tend to add networking accounts because you can add however many accounts you want. You can create any number of core accounts as necessary for your organization. Like we mentioned, highly customizable, very tailored for your own environment and subject to your design, right? But the networking is where everything that Anselmo was just talking about comes in. Transit gateway, centralized egress, centralized ingress, for example. Let's say we want to make sure that all of our traffic gets inspected before entering our environment or exiting our environment, right? Let's say we can use a tool like a Palo Alto. Ooh, Siri's talking to me. Let's say we use something like a Palo Alto or a Fortinet or a Cisco tool that is a front-end firewall that all data gets inspected before entering or exiting the environment. That's going to be done through that transit gateway. That's going to be hosted in that networking account. And then that networking account is going to use the transit gateway as that hub and spoke model to then route the traffic to any other account or VPC that you might need. So it becomes very handy. It's a very nifty tool, but as I mentioned before, the automation of Control Tower allows you to do it with ease. So let's talk about a few different customers that Logicworks has done this for. The first one is a large bank. Logicworks works with highly compliant PCI, HIPAA, high trust customers, and we have to obscure their names for compliance reasons. But let's just say this is a large bank. And as you can imagine, when you have large banks with multiple franchises, it's difficult getting everybody on the same page. They all have different requirements in terms of their access permissions. They have different components of their applications and different applications that they need to deploy. Every team is probably going to want to configure and control AWS differently. and they have hundreds of regulatory control environments, each project requiring a different subset. Let's say there's going to be PCI and HIPAA for some of these. There's just high trust for some. And as is the nature of wanting to migrate your IT, we're not trying to necessarily redefine the way that we do IT. We're not trying to redefine the roles and responsibilities and the way that we actually create apps right now. We just want to make sure that our infrastructure itself is secure, safe, and scalable, right? So, control tower. You can see up here, I realize that the diagram's a little small, but if you guys download it, you can see it zoomed in on your own. At the top level here, we have 2 data centers that are connected into that networking account that we were just talking about with a direct connect, right? In that networking account, we have a VPC, that's a WAN VPC with 2 Cisco CSRs. As we were talking about before, that's going to act as that transit routing, right? Any traffic that comes in or out is going to go through that Cisco CSR. It also allows us to have VPN connections, remote VPN connections, any users coming through that CSR, and they don't have to go through their own secure access points. You don't need to have whitelisted IP address to access a VPC or an instance. That's a very bad practice. If we centralize all of that into the networking account, it makes it much cleaner, much more secure, and much more scalable. Let's say you have 20,000 engineers, for example. It's much easier to handle 20,000 engineers going through a WAN VPC than it is individual 20,000 IP address whitelists, right? Throughout the account structure, you'll see that we have the application account. They've got a ton of their tools in here, like Jira, Confluence. They've got some databases. And in their shared account, we've got configuration management tools, Bastion hosts, Puppet, right? Ansible, so that you don't need to redeploy these tools in every account, every VPC. They're in that centralized shared services account and then leveraged via those cross-account roles from other accounts. We've got the logging account, security account. In your security account, same thing. You're going to have your IDS tools, your vulnerability scanning, anything that has a virtual appliance that leans towards security is going to go there. And then one huge benefit of Control Tower is that it actually helps you by centralizing your CloudTrail and config logs by default. There's a fair bit of automation that would be required for centralizing other logs like VPC flow logs or application logs. We actually have a solution for that and will be available on the Built on Control Tower program by AWS. Feel free to reach out to us if you're more interested. But like I said before, you can create any sort of add-ons that you'd like. But this is a great template architecture. Let's talk about another one. Multi-billion-dollar asset management firm, right? This was the largest private investment firm in the world, and they, as you could imagine, similarly have all kinds of compliance requirements. They pretty much handle everything, every kind of data, and therefore every application needs to be super, super detailed with the way that they're actually managing that data protection, right? Also, with the largest private investment firm, you could understand how many applications that they must have that they need to migrate, right? So this is the second use case that we talked about by segregating by business need instead of business unit, right? For this account, we actually decided to maintain 5 different isolated accounts by regulation requirements, right? There's production regulated, production non-regulated, non-production regulated, non-production non-regulated, and then that master account, right? We would use the account vending machine to actually ensure that the children account were built according to these predefined templates, that those guardrails are deployed by default, that the automation and networking tools would be deployed, and again, we have that centralized logging, which is really nice. This one is a little bit tougher to read, but you can see the same principles are in place. Over here, we've got a corporate data center, right? We have users that are entering via a Bastion host and then working through this networking account here. In that networking account, again, you'll see the same concept, that transit VPC with a Fortinet, right? That transit VPC is going to be connected to transit gateways. You know, the transit gateway can have a default route through that Fortinet appliance, right? And then you have access to the rest of your infrastructure. You have your API gateway that goes to your application, or you could have Lambda functions that are running their own queries over here. This customer was really interesting because a lot of their cutting edge applications were using a lot of big data AI ML tools like EMR, AWS Glue, Athena. So it was really interesting to see how they were using the cross account functionality while also maintaining this giant scale of migrated applications, making sure everything was secure and scalable, and also using the cutting edge technologies on the app side. So I've talked about this account vending machine a few times. As I mentioned, it's now called Account Factory as part of Control Tower, right? But it's pretty neat. Instead of you having to manually define how many accounts or what your account structure needs to look like, and again, those permissions, service control policies, every time, you can actually templatize that and then have the Account Factory deploy it for you via these CloudFormation stack sets, right? What it uses on the back end is service catalog. So I can create a service catalog of templates and say, well, this is what one business unit looks like, or this is what one customer looks like. For a lot of our single tenant SaaS companies, we tend to group them into t-shirt sizes, right? Let's say there's a small, medium, large, and extra large type of customer, right? We can create templates for each one of those t-shirt sizes and then use the Control Tower automation on the back end to deploy out with whatever foundations we need, however many VPCs, what the networking connections need to be, the transit gateways and the ENIs, elastic network interfaces that need to be deployed, subnets, things like that. It all takes it away from you with that automation. Just does it. You're saving a ton of time on operational concerns and constraints. You don't have to manually deploy this stuff. It's kind of set it and forget it. And the best thing is it's all parameterized. So if anything changes in the future, it's not hard coded. You can go and just make a slight tweak. You don't have to worry about rerunning your pipeline and managing the debugging, which I have a software engineering background. That is the worst thing ever. Maybe I missed a comma, maybe I didn't, you know, it does it for you. Just make sure that your parameters are set. I've mentioned this concept of single tenant SaaS companies a lot. Just want to emphasize it a little bit. For customers that are building these SaaS platforms, right? Logicworks is a SaaS accredited Logicworks Amazon partner, sorry, and we work with a lot of these customers where they have different t-shirt sizes. Each customer has different segregation and isolation requirements. We want to make sure that we can satisfy both the scale and security requirements while also satisfying the needs of the application itself. And Control Tower allows that. We can have different customers isolated into different environments and then have the application be deployed into each of these with their own security and permission requirements, not have to worry about data getting crossed between each other, because like I mentioned all the way at the beginning, the only way that's possible is if you actually specifically design it for that. So if you don't, then by default, it uses default deny policies just like any security group or any other software or solution in AWS. Then finally, for all you CFOs on the call, cross-account billing. As I mentioned, it has this really neat functionality where it allows us to see the bills for all accounts while also seeing segregation into each of them. So let's say I want to see what our overall AWS spend is. Well, that's just what my bill is. That's what AWS organizations is for, right? But I also want to see what that client portal team is using and how much it costs every month, right? Well, let's say that the client portal team is account 5, and we're like, hey guys, you guys are spending a good bit of money. Let's figure out why, and then we can use tagging structures thereafter. Whereas if it was all in a single account, it's really hard. You'd have to be very prescriptive and very granular with your tagging requirements in order to get that level of detail and granularity, right? Tagging is always a best practice. It's never going to go away. But if we can take some of that out with other logical groupings, then I think we're well on our way. So to summarize, if you're looking for a scalable, secure foundation for your AWS environment, Control Tower is your go-to. It's a great solution for complex, regulated AWS deployments. We want to focus on templatizing our work instead of manually deploying things. That's going to allow us to create governance through our automation. Control Tower comes with a prescriptive set of guardrails that you can tweak. We can deploy config conformance packs that you can check and say whether you're in or out of compliance with certain regulations and AWS well-architected standards. All of that is possible through Control Tower. However, you should still carefully evaluate whether or not you should create multiple VPCs or multiple accounts. It's not the best solution for everybody. If you've just got a small application and you're not expecting to grow, then maybe it's not the best fit for you. However, it is still the best recommended practice for pretty much any migration into AWS because of that low-level separation of concerns.
Excellent, so, Donovan. Is this, oh, you got one more slide here?
Yep, I was just going to say, if you guys have any questions, feel free to contact us. Like I said, I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture. Logicworks is a cloud services provider focusing on managed services and professional services